My name is Michaela Cannon, and this is my speech on women's suffrage. Here's my audience, my mom and my husband. This is my second submission because the first one, Zoom is not recording the audio, so my slideshow's on that one, but this is where you can actually hear my speech. Susan B. Anthony said, "There shall be another season of silence until women have the same rights men have on this green earth." Today, we have the privilege of voting as women and being able to vote on a lot of the laws that are being passed. Without that right, we would not have the right to vote on things like abortion or a lot of laws having to do with equal pay or even just getting out and going to live our everyday lives. Imagine your grandmother, your mom, your sister not being able to vote on things that have to do with how they live their everyday lives. That's exactly how women felt in the early 1900s before 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. According to a quote from the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he says, "That woman is man's equal, was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she be recognized as such." Why suffrage matters to me is because I was raised by a lot of very independent women in my life, and I was taught to be a strong and independent woman and voice how I feel. Without Susan B. Anthony and a lot of other important women in history, I wouldn't be able to do those things every day, and they wouldn't have been able to make me the woman I am today. The women's suffrage movement completely changed the course of all women's history. Today, I will address the origins of inequality, the awakening of women's voices, and the long struggle they had ahead of them. The women's suffrage movement in total took about 70 years. It was first talked about in the late 1700s by a lot of important women in Britain, and they actually had the right to vote before women in the United States. Social Historian, in their article titled "Women's Occupations," states that the top occupations for women were jobs like servants, factory workers, laundry workers, and teachers. A lot of women were not able to work jobs where it was primarily men, especially in Congress or important roles, and women could not vote. They couldn't own their own property or participate in public life, like things such as going to the grocery store, going out to get their laundry, or even taking their kids to school every day. There was no equal pay as well. Social Security Association says that women made 30% of what men made in the early 1900s. Now that we've talked about why women wanted suffrage and wanted to voice their opinions, I want to dive a little bit into women finally awakening their voices. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton emerged as prominent voices for women's rights. They created a lot of the very first conventions and meetings. One of the first recorded was in Seneca Falls, which even Frederick Douglass attended. As I quoted earlier, he was formerly enslaved and believed in rights for everyone, not just men and women, but men and women of every color, including Black men and Asian Americans, Native Americans, which Asian Americans and Native Americans weren't able to vote until way after the 19th Amendment was even passed. Over 5,000 women attended another parade in Washington, D.C., where they marched and picketed all along the street in front of the White House. In 1848, there were laws passed and created to let women vote state by state, and it had to be voted to be approved. By 1896, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming granted women the right to vote. As women's political power grew, so did the dangers surrounding them. A lot of women were beaten, thrown in jail, convinced they were on the brink of insanity, and even thrown into solitary confinement because they were voicing their opinions and going to these different meetings and conventions. In 1918, Jeannette Rankin proposed the 19th Amendment, but it failed. And it was the exact same amendment that Susan B. Anthony had written over 20 years ago. It wasn't until 1920 that President Wilson came out to be in favor and proposed the same amendment. and it was finally passed. On August 26th, 1920, the 19th Amendment was written into the Declaration of Independence, and women were finally able to vote. They were able to take courses and classes to learn how to vote and exercise that right every time there was an election. I believe it's very important to look back and remember that without over 70 years of fighting, women wouldn't have a say in what happens today, and we wouldn't be able to be free and independent. And that was my speech on women's suffrage. Thank you so much, class, for learning and listening with me and my audience. Bye.